Well, well, thank you for inviting me. I'm going to try to do two things at the same time. One, to give the talk, which I'm supposed to give, and I'm going to do so, but also to show this map and to play a little bit with this map, which is an inventory of cases of environmental conflict that we are doing. And, well, shouldn't say Rio Tinto. Well, if you go through here, you'll find all the cases. But the good thing about it is that you can also go here and find, depending on, for instance, the category. The category means what the causes of the conflicts are from a sort of metabolic point of view. For instance, we have cases which have to do with precisely fossil fuels and climate justice. For instance, red conflicts would be here, red plus, but also coal power stations, thermal coal power stations, or coal mining, or oil extraction, or gas fracking, and the other. So within this category we have many other categories, many other commodities, and then we have all this. But this would be like another talk sometime next year or in the future, because it's a lot of work to do this, and we have 1,261 conflicts. I just look at it. Every day is advancing 2 or 3. And there are many people working on this around the world, and it's a big European project which is about to finish about 6 months' time, and we want to continue part of it, which is the Atlas. And of course, for this talk is very relevant because we're going to talk about precisely fossil fuels extraction conflicts. And also we could talk about carbon uptake conflicts in forests or other tree plantations. So the talk was announced like this, and I'll read it again, under the title of Leave the Oil in the Soil, and Leave the Coal in the Hole, and Leave the Gas under the Grass, which is not my own attempt to English poetry, but I could write perhaps Catalan poetry, or I did it when I was 15 years old or so. But this was said the first time by Nimo Bassi from Nigeria, who said this idea of leave the oil in the soil and leave the coal in the hole. And now we have added gas under the grass and tar sands under the land and so on. The idea then is this slogan exists because there have been people around the world claiming that it's a good idea to leave fossil fuels under the soil for local reasons mainly, but also because as a contribution against climate change. In this project, EJOL, which means Environmental Justice Organizations, Liabilities and Trade, we have collected cases of conflicts about many things, but also including, as I said, oil, gas and coal extraction and transport and burning in power stations. And our coverage is still very uneven, country-wise. As you see, there are very little in China yet, but we are making progress. And usually the reasons to leave the oil in the soil and the coal in the hole are local reasons, but in some cases, as I said, explicit relations to climate change have been made by some of the social actors. For instance, at present, there are proposals like this, not only the failed proposal in the Yasuni ITT case in Ecuador, but also there are cases going on in the Naja Delta, which of course have an old origin, like in Ogoniland against Shell, but also leaving coal in the Paramos of Colombia, in the highlands of Colombia, and there is a debate right now on the delimitation of the Paramos, which is these high plateaus in the Andes with very rich, or which are very important for the water supply and so on, or also in Norway, in the Lofoten Islands, or right now in the Canary Islands in West Africa, in Spain, belonging to Spain, where the local government wants to have, the regional government, a referendum against oil prospection by Repsol. You know, the regional referendums in Spain are a very hot issue. In Catalonia, for instance, but with a different content. He is against oil prospection. In one of the EJOL reports, and this was number 6, we went through all these cases, and I'm going to give here copies to you of the policy brief that came out of this report. I think they will reach you. And because I'm going to use this, I didn't bring a PowerPoint, I brought these photocopies to make some points. If you see that they are finishing, perhaps you can keep one for every 2 of you, because perhaps they won't reach. And some of these cases of complaints against oil extraction or tar sand extraction are mentioned in Naomi Klein's new book, which is called This Changes Everything, and she gives the name of Blockadia to these cases. Blockadia is something that she heard in some, I don't know whether Keystone XL events in somewhere in the States, or in the Umistoten blockade in West, I think it's in British Columbia in Canada. In some of these cases, people have been themselves, the activists, blockading the oil pipes and the gas pipes. These people are saying that they want to, that they call themselves the people of Blockadia. And this is what fits what Woody is saying. So it's not only, and she quotes from the EJOL report. So Naomi Klein, whom I know personally but not very much, she read this report and she said this is very interesting, and she quotes this idea of leaving oil in the soil as something that is very relevant for against climate change, or very relevant, increasingly relevant perhaps. So this is the connection. Before this, before going into commenting what I am passing around now, I'm going to read from a review of 2 books which I finished yesterday, because I had to review one of them at least. And it's a book by Henry Shue, S-H-U-E, from Oxford, from Merton College, a moral philosopher, who had written a book, published a book called Climate Justice, Vulnerability and Protection. So I'm going to read some paragraphs from this, and then some paragraphs from a review of Naomi Klein's book. And the reason I want to compare both books, Henry Shue, Climate Justice, and Naomi Klein, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, which came out 2 or 3 months ago, is that they take a different line on what means climate justice. One is climate justice from a moral philosophy, from somebody like Henry Shue, who is a US citizen living in the stand, living in Oxford for a long time, and very angry with the US government because they are not doing very much about climate change, and saying that something should be done, and putting forward moral philosophy arguments for this, which I'm going to summarize. The other book by Naomi Klein is from a journalist, or a highly successful journalist, and the book is from, so to speak, from the bottom up, to some extent, in the sense that she does this, she goes around, she talks to people who are doing this kind of complaints against oil or coal or gas extraction, and she makes a general case about this, calling all these places Blockadia, and saying this is what we're going to see in Paris next year at the Conference of the Parts, a big 1 million people, well, she's not saying, I am saying this, 1 million people, perhaps all reading Naomi Klein's book, which will be, I would like to be an author with about 1/100th of the success that she has, isn't it, with my own. Anyway, there is the 2 different ways of looking at climate justice, as a kind of grassroots, more or less, movement, or as a kind of moral philosophy discussion, what does climate justice mean. And what Henry Shue does is to followed the trajectory from 92 or before, from 86, and when the IPCC started, on what the new issues have been and how moral philosophy or himself have discussed these coming issues. He doesn't talk yet about acidification of the oceans. He doesn't talk very much about geoengineering, although he mentions this, but he mentions many other things. And he comes, Henry Shue, from international law, international discussions about justice, from the international jurisdictions on torture and war, and the fact that there is this international now jurisdiction. For instance, even now some people from a few remaining ministers from General Franco are being now sued in Argentina, which I find is about time, isn't it? By a judge in Buenos Aires, which sort of reciprocating on what Garzón did in Spain, or against some Argentinians, and against Pinochet when Pinochet was here. So there is the international justice, and Shue is asking himself whether this could apply to climate change also. And he started to write on climate change in the early 90s, and as many others, including myself, he was very much impressed by Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narayan's booklet of 91, which is called Global Warming in an Unequal World. Global Warming in an Unequal World, a Case of Environmental Colonialism. In that book, which, how many remember that booklet? Many of you are engineers, I think. So perhaps you don't read booklets like this, or you did. It will be useful for me now to continue to know how many of you remember Sunita Narayan and Anil Agarwal's booklet, you would, isn't it, of 91, called Global Warming in an Unequal World, a Case of Environmental Colonialism, which was very influential and came out from an NGO in Delhi, and with that title, and they were discussing, very angry, discussing the figures put forward by the World Resources Institute, showing that after all everybody was involved in CO2 emissions to some extent, and not sort of making a distributive justice argument of the situation. And they said there are necessary or subsistence emissions and there are luxury emissions, they said. Well, many of us clearly have more than subsistence emission of CO2, and many of us would not say that we have luxury emissions, but we produce on average as Europeans about 10 tons of carbon dioxide or 12 tons of carbon dioxide per person per year, instead of just 2 or 3 for an average citizen of India, at least at the time, in 91, 92. And they said you cannot ask from reductions for everybody, and so they made this, what is called distributive justice argument. And so Henry Shue, in this new book, Climate Justice, starts from this, and he says this is quite true, this is still very relevant. But this is not the only relevant argument, that there is this injustice in the present generation in the distribution, and that not everybody should do the same kind of reductions, which after all is already in the Treaty of 92, historical responsibility. He says there is also positive harm being done. Positive harm being done from the rich today or historically to the rest of the population in the globe and to future generations and to other species, but he's talking more about poor people today. And because there is this harm being done, what can be done to redress the harm, to correct the harm? And he asked himself whether there is any way of going to jurisdiction, to some kind of court of justice, to claim damages for what is being done. And he mentioned some cases, and one which is quite famous and which we mention in this report number 6 of Vigil that they distributed the policy brief, is the case in the Kivalina village in Alaska against the Exxon oil company in 2008, which ended in failure, so it was not admitted by the courts and nothing happened. But there is a village which they claim that there is already the sea is increasing, and also I suppose it's because the ice is disappearing, and they were trying to sue an oil company. And this, of course, there are going to be more cases like this of people trying to sue either governments, like the US government would be the favorite one, or companies, because the favorite one because of the amount of CO2 per capita, and also because they didn't ratify Kyoto, so they are behaving in a very obvious sort of different way from the European Union, but also companies, isn't it? And this is something that could happen. But as we know, the US has always argued that there is no guilt or culpability in this. So there are historical emissions. I am going to quote from Henry Shue, who quotes from Todd Stern, the ambassador of the US in Copenhagen in 2009. And Todd Stern said, when he reached Copenhagen against the Bolivians, people who were talking about the climate debt, he said, "We recognize the historical role of the US in putting emissions in the air, in the atmosphere, but our government has no sense of guilt or culpability, and we object to the word reparations," which of course is a very loaded word in international political European history, isn't it? And in many other places. However, against this view by Todd Stern that there is some kind of acknowledgement of unequal contribution, but not any intention of paying reparations or admitting guilt, there is another principle which is called, as you know, strict liability, which many people have written about this, which applies in cases like, for instance, of environmental legislation, like the European Environment Liability Directive of 2004, is it? And also in the CERCLA, Comprehensive Environmental Responsibility and Liability Act in the US, colloquially is called the Superfund, in which there is retroactive, you can make a retroactive claim for a company to pay for damage that was done years before, even before there was any legislation on the particular damage. This is what is called in the different languages in which law is written with different names, but in English this is called strict liability, like objective liability, which means that you have. So this is the discussion. So it's not just that there is an equal distribution in the emissions, it's also that harm is being produced, and how this harm could be corrected, or how could claims be done because of this harm being done, perhaps through the law, through an international law, similar to the law against war crimes, which of course is criminal law, but perhaps in civil law or some kind of legislation that would allow these claims to be made, assuming that strict liability would apply, something which is not admitted by the rich countries' governments. It's not just the US. The European Union does not admit that there is this historical responsibility, yes, but not historical punishment, so to speak. It's different being responsible than being punished. For instance, talking in the European context, there are other, well, I'm not going to talk about war crimes because everybody knows, and it's not totally relevant yet in a way, because for climate change this is not being applied. One could not only look at whether, I am following Henry Shue, whether this international legislation is going to be enacted and is going to be operational, but also to what Boaventura Sousa Santos calls subaltern legality. So the use that grassroots movements, villages, peasants have made of the law in the course of social and economic history. And he invented this words, I think, subaltern, or the use by the subalterns in the poor, but Gramsci called them the subalterns, how they use the law. And in this, one could go much farther than Schuh goes, and in the direction of Naomi Klein or our own project, Eagle, in which we have many examples of this. Proposals by grassroots groups in the world claiming a climate debt or a carbon debt or an ecological debt. This was born in Latin America, actually in Santiago de Chile. The first booklet was published in 1991, claiming that the North owed the South, in Spanish, una deuda ecológica, as they put it, partly because of the ozone layer at the time, which was discussed, and also already discussing climate change. And it's very interesting to see the evolution of this concept, whether what kind of well, we would call this of impact factor this idea has had, either in academic literature or in politics. Just now, in the next issue of the journal called Global Environmental Change, which in itself has a high impact factor, I don't know exactly why, but it's a good journal, Global Environmental Change. They have we have an article coming from Eagle by Richard Varlenius from Sweden, in which he is summarizing the whole debate on the ecological debt, but more concretely on the climate debt and the carbon debt. These are all synonymous ways of. This means the claim, not in a criminal court, because you cannot do this, but the claim in no court still, but the potential claim that could be done from the north, from the south, so to speak, from the India, from the countries with low per capita emissions, or from grassroots groups against the rich or the rich countries or the Annex I countries because of this inequality, historical inequality, and because of the damage that will be done or is already being done. On this issue of the climate debt, there are like two lines of discussion. One, people who are in favor of this, like myself. I have written about this. Since '97, I have written quite often with groups in Latin America who wanted to have some kind of academic cover for this kind of claims. But also another line, which is a line against it. So in France, there is a very well-known environmental economist called Olivier Godard, who is now writing and saying that we people who have been talking about the carbon debt or climate debt and so on, like Christian Aid here or Andrew Sims in London for the last 10 or 15 years, we have made a terrible mistake, because by helping the people to put this, or some people going, presidents and prime ministers who go to the Conference of the Parts. I was in Copenhagen in the main room, and at least 30% of the presidents and prime ministers were talking about the climate debt, isn't it? To no avail. I mean, this was just words. Nobody was paying. In the upper room was Obama and Manmohan Singh or the rest talking about other things. So, but they were, so from one point of view, talking about the climate debt is something that put shame, in a way, perhaps, shame the rich countries historically and today for historical responsibility and liability, and therefore would be like a factor saying, please do something because you have something to, a moral debt at least, and perhaps an economic debt if we do the calculations, and some calculations have been done. On the other hand, people like Olivier Godard in France, I come back to Olivier Godard, who says by making this very radical claim, what you are doing is putting more difficulty still in the negotiations, because of course in a negotiation, if you go to one extreme, then the negotiation is supposed to be more difficult. Since nothing is happening, in fact, including the Obama-Chinese thing, I think does not amount to much, isn't it? Because Obama is not very powerful in his own country. He will be more powerful here, perhaps, but not in his own country in these matters of climate change, at least. And the Chinese are saying that they will start, the emissions will peak in 2050, isn't it? Anyway, what will happen, we don't know, but this is not. The point is that in these arguments that I am summarizing here, we have then something called the climate debt, and I am explaining the argument about this, and I am saying that Henry Shaw, incidentally, he doesn't consider this, because he's talking in a framework of the climate justice that he's talking with the Mary Robinson Foundation, and very much with what I call here the certified policymakers, but not with the grassroots, kind of Naomi Klein, Rabo, the Blockadia people who are making it, but including also many presidents and prime ministers. Then there is another point I want to make here on the Henry Shaw book, which is relevant to what we are saying, which is that he says, and I totally agree, that economics is not a good way of going about deciding what to do. And since we are here in a Grantham Institute, but I know it's not the LSE Grantham Institute, I thought you were cousins or something like this, or relatives, your sisters. Good. Because I'm going to mention the name of Nicholas Stern, because Henry Shaw says economics is not a good way of deciding. We should, in fact, talk about rights and not utility. Future generations and poor people, and why not other species, but he doesn't mention other species very much, have rights. So a right to a minimum amount of CO2 could be considered like a right. But no, we have no right to 10 tons of carbon dioxide, we should not. So he wants to discuss this in terms of rights, not of comparisons of utility. And the whole discussion in economics, the economics of climate change, has of course been done in terms of utility and intertemporal comparisons of utility. And a lot has been around the issue of the discount rate. So you had on the one side Nordhaus in Yale for a very long time. Very early he started to talk about climate change, and he was saying, we don't have to do anything. Please don't do anything, because the cost of doing something are more or less high, and the benefits will be in the future. I discount the future at 6% per year, because this is what I would get. I said that he was saying this many years ago. What I say when I buy treasury bills of the US, so public debt, which he would get much less now, but that's what he said. And therefore, discounting this, which in a way represents the expectation of growth of the economy, or at least the expectations of growth in the revenue of the US state, which promises to pay that rate of interest, and of course means that the taxes are going to go up and so on. So in a way, discounting is like what you expect the economy to grow, even from a non-egoistical point of view. We discount because they are going to be richer in the future. This is the economist assumption. So this is Nordhaus. And Stern came along and said, this is too much. This is to 6% is far too much. I am going to discount only, I don't remember, 1.5%, something like this, or 2%. But based on the same assumption, the assumption of the higher prosperity of future generations, which is like an economist's religious principle. There is no empirical base apart from economist equations, because if you put that the rate of investment is so much and the capital output ratio, the marginal, is so much, then you can say the economy is going to look like this. But these are what Joseph Reagan called paper and pencil exercises, which today is done by computer, but I mean they are paper and pencil exercises. So there is no basis to say that per capita the world economy is going to grow 1%, 2%, 6%, 0%, minus 1%. We don't know. It's because we have peak oil and we also are going to have to do something about climate change. We don't know. And therefore all this discussion in economics about the rate of discount enabled to be able to compare the future benefits and cost and today's benefits and cost is not the way to go about it, according to Henry Shaw, and I totally agree with him. The way to go about it is more with the precautionary principle, or by giving rights to future generations in some way. And this is what Dick Norgard, ecological economists like Rich Howard, Dick Norgard, Klein already said, and they are not so famous. They should be more famous than Nicholas Stern. The criteria would be not fidelity to economics, but fidelity to the cause, to the question you are discussing, which is not amenable, one could argue, to this kind of economic reasoning. So this is something that Xu says quite explicitly, that economics is not very good to discuss climate change. And then he, to summarize the end of this book, because I think it's useful for me to put this book first on what a moral philosopher says about climate change before going to the more socially based kind of discussion or environmental movement based kind of discussion. He says then that, going back to the beginning, we all need a certain amount of energy because climate policy, climate change, the question of climate change is after all a question of energy, what kinds of energy. So if we discuss energy, we have to go back to this discussion between the minimum endosomatic energy and the exosomatic energy, as Lotka said, or vital energy, as Frederick Soddy said, vital energy, or the sort of energy for working or for other uses. That has been done for the last 100 years already in human ecology, or by people, by proto-ecological economists, as Frederick Soddy, who was a Nobel Prize in chemistry, as some of you would remember his work on radioactivity, but he wrote a lot also about energy and the economy in the 20s and 30s, talking exactly as we would do today, as about the second law and entropy and how debt was virtual debt and was very different from the real wealth and so on. So Frederick Soddy, who was also from Merton College and should be better known, especially in this country because he was totally British, Frederick Soddy. So these ideas about endosomatic energy and exosomatic, vital energy, which means after all that some energy is to some extent a need for everybody, some minimum amount or some dignified amount, whatever, or some, and this is reflected in the carbon dioxide emissions, and the others, these luxury emissions, as they said in Delhi already so many, 25 years ago. And he ends by saying, on a pessimistic note, saying that perhaps the world has committed an unforgivable sin, which I find very interesting words from a moral philosopher, because I don't know what you do with sins. You can repent from sins, or you can get pardon from sins, depending on your religion, isn't it? If you are Catholic, you are pardoned. If you are Protestant, not so much. I don't know. I am not. I stopped worrying about these things quite a few decades ago. But I mean, that he calls this an unforgivable sin is not just a nice turn of phrase. It's very meant for you to think about it. The other book by Naomi Klein is very different. It's different, a different style. It's a powerful call from Canada for reinforcing, as I already said this, a global movement for climate justice, which she says, and I say, and other people, Patrick Bond, people who are involved in this, we say that it's already going on. The global movement for climate justice. How do I know this? Because if you go to Copenhagen, not to the main room, but to the outside room, you find people with banners saying climate justice now, and then the police battling them. So there is a movement. This is a social movement of 100,000 people also in Copenhagen, and we'll see in Paris how many turn up. But what is important, of course, is not just these people spending lots of fossil fuels to go to Copenhagen or to Paris, but or to come into London to talk about this, like myself, but is more that the fact that there is a very large number of groups around the world who are connecting the issue of climate change with the issue of leaving oil in the soil or coal in the hole or gas under the grass because their own local needs, and not principles, more livelihood needs quite often, just livelihood needs. Sometimes with a touch of sacredness also. They said, this is sacred, and really it is sacred. For instance, for the Yasuni indigenous people, especially the non-contacted, see, if they are not contacted, we don't know what they think or what they would say, but probably they would say that many of the trees and the rivers and so on are more or less sacred. So it's livelihood, sacredness, environmental values, all things that cannot be properly translated into money values, and which motivate these people to complain locally and to make the connection. When was the connection made for the first time? The connection between the local struggles and the climate change, to my knowledge, which is quite specialized on this, but I might be wrong, was done for the first time between 95 and 97. And many people don't know this, including Henry Shue. He doesn't mention this, perhaps because it was done not in a university, or was done when people from Ecuador and from Nigeria got together and founded Oil Watch in November or October 95 in Ecuador, in the forest, in the rainforest. Just a month before, Ken Saro-Wiwa was, and 9 other people were killed by the Nigerian dictatorship. And this was, of course, very much mentioned in London, isn't it? Because of the connections with Nigeria and because Shell was involved. And there are still lots of court cases going on about these criminal cases in several places without much success, actually. And also civil cases against Shell for damage in Ogoni land and in other places in the Niger Delta. So it's a big local issue, stopping oil extraction and gas flaring in the Niger Delta. And this Oil Watch, they put the name in English because they were international, although one can also use other languages. Via Campesina, it's in Spanish. And there are no international organizations in Catalan or in small languages, but Spanish is useful apparently. Via Campesina. But Oil Watch is a small, relatively small, 50 or 60 groups around the world who are concerned about this, about oil extraction and refineries. And in 97, if you go to Google and you Google Oil Watch Kyoto 97, you will see that they were in the parallel meetings and they produced like 3 or 4 pages of explanation, which in my book, The Environmentalists of the Poor, is reproduced in print. And they said exactly this, that it's a good idea to leave oil in the soil in areas of great biodiversity value, where poor people were really fighting for survival. So some local conditions, and that because of this, the oil should be kept in the soil, and that this would be good for the fight against climate change. And that's why they went to Kyoto. They went to Kyoto because they thought this was an appropriate venue to put this. Nobody paid the slightest attention to this in the official conference in Kyoto, or even outside the thing, for a long time, until perhaps, in my own knowledge of this, and this is explained in detail in this report, EJOL report, which I give to you a small summary, which was published last year, because we talked to the people themselves. They wrote about this from Ecuador and from Nigeria, until the early 2000s, and even more in 2006, when there were elections in Ecuador, and Correa won the elections, together with a group of people who were very much in the environmental movement, including Alberto Acosta, who became the Minister of Energy and Mining. He chose that ministry, the difficult one, because what he wanted to do is to pay attention to what Acción Ecológica was saying, who had got together with IRA, Environmental Rights Action in Nigeria, led at the time by Nimo Bassi, who has one of these Right Livelihoods Awards, is quite well known. He was the president of Friends of the Earth International a few years ago. Nimo Bassi And they got together. Nimbavas wrote a little book afterwards because it's the first time he went to Ecuador, so he was interested. And these people from Acción Ecológica, they are all, the most part is a group like 20 people, many of them women biologists. So very interesting, attractive group of people to work with, very enterprising. And they had this idea of having a moratorium on oil extraction. This was what they were calling for, a moratorium. And this then became the Yasuni ITT proposal, which I have no time to explain, and many will know, which was to leave 850 million barrels of oil, more or less, because we don't know exactly how many there are, in one part of this natural park or national park. Many people think if this is a national park, should not be oil extraction, true, but this is not how the world works. And there is already oil extraction in the Yasuni National Park. And this was in the last corner of the park, next to the border with Peru, where there is also oil exploration with Repsol, which has now stopped. So the idea was 450 million barrels of oil, which would correspond to about 850 or 820 million tons of carbon dioxide, and which is a lot of carbon dioxide. It's like, oh, a lot of what I said 850 million of tons, which is equivalent to 410 million tons of carbon dioxide, which are like the emissions of France or Spain in 1 year. France, because it's so nuclear that it has less. So it's a lot to dump into the decrepit carbon market, as you know. So, I mean, which is over, the supply is already too large with all the European policy of giving too many permissions. So this was not the idea of dumping this there, because could not be done legally either. The idea was to find somebody who would be interested in sharing the opportunity cost. And for a time it worked very well, because the Bundestag passed a resolution saying we're in favor of this in June 2008. Then Correa quarreled with Acosta or vice versa, and it started to go badly, I think, internally in Ecuador. Correa is totally anti-environmental, as I wrote in 2007 already. In an interview, and I got it right. I didn't know what he would do, but that he would boycott it internally. That's what he did. And so the thing is not working. But as an example, as an idea from the South, has had followers, as I said at the beginning. One follower I didn't say at the beginning would be in Colombia, not only the Páramos for coal, but also in San Andres and Providencia Islands, who now, after they stopped oil exploration, they are coral reef, beautiful places, and the local fishermen didn't want oil exploration, so it's a kind of environmentalism of the poor there, but together with allies. But now this belongs to Nicaragua after a court case in The Hague, so we don't know what will happen. So one could go and try to collect other cases. For instance, I don't know whether people in Sussex here, Barcombe is called the place, Barcombe, a village in Sussex, what's the place called? Yeah, which is not exactly a case of environmentalism of the poor, I am sure, or I guess, but in which people, as of many other places in Europe, are against gas fracking, isn't it? The same thing happens in France, and France is too beautiful, so it's forbidden in France for the time being. But it's also happening in Romania with Chevron, which is more the environmentalists of the poor, because the poor people are peasants complaining against this, and in other places. So, well, one could collect, and there is somebody in France called Maxime Combe, which is in attack, and is one of the leaders of this anti-fracking movement in France. For him, obviously, the connection is obvious, and he's in the report. He has an article in our EJOL report connecting keeping gas under the soil with the fact that of unburnable fuels. We know, more or less, that we should live, or at least that the rate of extraction and burning of fossil fuels should be much slower than it is now. It's not that we have to leave 2/3 on the soil. It depends. If we, in the last 500 years, I suppose, depending on what happens with many other things like forest or carbon sequestration or whatever, we could extract all of it perhaps over the next 5,000 years. What is happening is that the rate of extraction and burning is too fast, isn't it? And this is why there is all this debate about unburnable fuels that in London, or in the city of London, because it's the city, has taken a kind of financial side to it, saying what the assets of the oil companies or the fossil fuel companies are overpriced. They have lots of toxic assets because they are not going to sell this, and even more if universities disinvest, or the Church of England, or whoever it is. But this is peanuts, actually, or groundnuts, because, in a way to put it shortly, because of the time, because what is important is to say that if 2/3 have to be left under the ground, because we have to reduce by half the current emissions, which are still increasing, because China is in peak emissions in 2000, peak emissions, not decreasing the emissions, just the peak emissions, and are increasing 2 parts per million per year. So we are going to reach 450 in 25 more years, or less, 24 at the rate of today, or 23, 200, 450. Therefore, we have to leave fossil fuels in the ground, or do many other things, but this would be one of the obvious things. And therefore, this is the rationale for all this. And one could then go to an inventory like this, or even a better inventory like this, and do a book or a thesis in Imperial College, perhaps, if you don't have one already, or in the other Grantham Institute, the LSE, because they are more into this kind of environmental sociology or political ecology. It is called political ecology, and do an inventory of cases where this connection, local, the conflict has become, as they say, glocal. Not only because they are very well known, like Yasuni or the Ogoni in Nigeria, in the Niger Delta, but because they are making the connections themselves to reinforce the argument. And then I could go on about this more, because this is the point, the main point, that from the point of view of what we are talking today, that Naomi Klein is making in her book, apart from many other things. So I have no time to, but what I'm going to do also in this kind of, is to give to you copies of these book reviews I have written, because I had no, and perhaps because this is a lot for 1 hour, isn't it? So normally after a seminar there are questions, or answers at least, or complaints or something. So it would be good, the last 5 minutes perhaps. Yeah. This fits very much with a book that came out in London 3 days ago, which is called Degrowth, of which I am a co-author. That's quite, but also I'm very proud because this has come from a group of people who live in Barcelona, many from other places, in our institute. One is Georgios Kallis, who is the main one, who did a degree in chemistry in Imperial College. And nevertheless, today is a political ecologist, very well known. Or because of this, he's now a political ecologist. And so we wrote this is called a dictionary of degrowth. It's a kind of vocabulary of degrowth, or post-growth, whatever one. And of course, what we are discussing here is something which I have also written about and published, which is the alliance between post-growth or prosperity without growth, to talk like Tim Jackson, which I like very much, because it's not so offensive as degrowth, isn't it? Prosperity without growth in the north, and the global environmental justice movement. Because you cannot go to India or to Ecuador and say you have to degrow. Okay? But you can say, if you leave the oil in the soil in Yasuni, if you tax oil exports or copper exports or whatever you're doing, at least tax them. Don't sell them so cheaply. And we have called this the Delhi-Korea tax because Herman Delhi wrote about this. So we tried to convince Korea, and Korea once went to OPEC and said, yes, we're going to tax exports of oil, and the money we'll put in a fund for solar energy in the world and against energy poverty. But then they didn't pay much attention. So this alliance between environmental justice and this post-vacuum, post-growth movement in the North is what I think will happen in the next few decades, in the next century perhaps, or before.
Okay, thank you very much for the very interesting talk. We do have some time for questions, and then we've got some drinks afterwards. So I'm going to ask a question. Yeah, there's the mic. Finally got.
There are some more if anybody is.
No, it's recorded. So if you could speak into it.
Ian Goff from the Grantham at LSE. I'm really pleased to see you picking up on Henry Shu's distinction between necessary and luxury emissions. I've written a book on human needs, which ties into this.
Yes,
so I was very pleased to see that. But I'd just like to put an argument of Nick Stern's against bringing up this issue now. He says the key thing is to decarbonise world energy drastically over the next 35 years, and that pushing for these equality arguments will be destructive. And his famous phrase is, equal access to a train wreck is not a very desirable sort of strategy. How would you answer that?
Well, no, implicitly already, and Henry Shu would also argue this, that there are these justice arguments. Of course, his main point is that justice is not only about distribution. That's the main point, because this is very easy. I learned this 25 years ago when I read this booklet by Anil Agarwal and Sulita Narayan, and now I see more of this as a kind of aggression, although I don't know if he uses the name, but an international harm being done by some, and they cannot take refuge under sovereignty. And he discusses this very thoroughly, why sovereignty is not a refuge like it was not or should not have been a refuge for Pinochet, for instance, in the same kind of line. And although it's not criminal cases. In that case, of course, is not saying that we are all in the same train. Precisely, we are not in the same train. Some are first class and some are in other class, and therefore people who are going to take, they or their descendants are going to pay the costs, and they have not having any benefits, should be entitled to complain of this, isn't it? And perhaps to claim, this is my own view, this carbon debt. And this, I think, could be useful to push the negotiations into a more decisive kind of thing. That's why I think. Yes. And this has happened to some extent, the alliance of small island states, which has disappeared because they were, I don't know what has happened with the alliance of small island states, but for a long time they were going to the COPs and saying, we are going to be under the water, well, some of them at least, isn't it? And we are complaining what they're going to do with us, and this was Tuvalu and other famous cases. But it's not just, so it's different from mitigation. There is mitigation, adaptation, isn't it? This is a different line. It's saying justice, environmental justice. But in the COP now, in one of the last meetings, they introduced something called loss and damage, which was a kind of, have you been involved in this yourself? Because I don't quite understand whether it was a kind of maneuver from somebody in the Secretariat to say, yes, I agree with you, people complaining from the South, we'll put, instead of climate debt, because this is too strong, let's call it loss and damage. The losses that countries are going to have, and people, and the damage which is being done to them and to their successors, which is the same thing, is trying to put it. Then there is the other question whether this climate debt should be counted and paid for in money terms, The people I know from the south, who sometimes are very radical environmentalists, like Acción Ecológica, they say, we don't want to see any money. Although some people here in Britain, for instance, at the time, in the year 2000, there was this campaign called Jubilee South from the Christian churches saying the external debt of the South is too high. I don't know what the Jubilee was in the scriptures, but every 1,000 years, I hope it's a bit sooner, every 100 years. So, and one reason for the South not to pay the financial debt would be that they are not real debtors, they are creditors of the ecological debt. And this was an argument that was very much done around the year 2000. Other people, and I agree with these other people, are a bit more radical and say, we don't want to discuss the money. What we want is that the ecological debt does not increase anymore. Enough is enough. If you don't want to pay, don't pay, but enough is enough. Don't increase it anymore. And acknowledge what you have done in the past. Or if you pay something, this something should be like a token of responsibility, of repentance, or whatever you want to call it. It's like payments from Germany after the Second World War, in which most Germans agreed that this should be done. Because, but the money does not it's not the polluter pays, that you pay and you can do it again, isn't it? It's not a fine either. It's a kind of token of, it's not that you value the human lives or anything like this, although to some extent this comes up. Is that is a token, money becomes like a sign of, and in that sense the ecological debt could be like this, and this money could go to some useful things, like, again, so that from your own question, the whole discussion has progressed a lot in some ways, but not at all in the official negotiations. But I don't know what will happen next.
So if you don't envisage, if you don't think that there is a need for financial transfers, then by stopping any further extraction, at least of those 2/3, what would happen is before there is enough renewables available or feasible, the price of fossil fuels would increase tremendously. And so how can you ensure equality and justice for the southern countries if the price they have to pay for development is much higher?
Well, I don't know that, yeah. It's not a question, I think, of stopping the 2/3 next Monday, so to speak. It's more that the argument can be used to select the places where coal or gas or should be left in the soil. Because take the case of Ecuador. Ecuador takes about 500,000 barrels of oil per day. The country lives from this to a large extent. The government gives money to poor people and everybody's pleased, and he will be elected again and again if this is possible. But all this is financed to some extent, to a large extent, by all exports, and this is acknowledged by everybody. So the question would be to reduce little by little, which is going to happen anyway, but would be in Ecuador, which is the best place to leave oil in the soil. Well, I don't know, there can be many other. In fact, there are one example, which is in the thing I distributed, is a community called Sarayaco, which much before all this, they themselves stopped an Argentinian oil company from coming into this place, also in the rainforest. And from there, when now people talk about Sumac Causay and Buen Vivir, it was from one of these, are you from Ecuador? One of these Viteris from Sarayaco, who started to write about these old ideas in Quechua that they were using. But apart from this, the fact is that this community, which is 1,500 people, stopped the oil company. And they got into a court case, international court case for human rights, and they won. And for the time being, there is no oil there. So how to select the places in the world? Well, we have to be a mixture of the biodiversity value, like the Paramos in Colombia or Providencia, or the local support for this, isn't it? In which direction? In the direction of reducing extraction overall. But it is true that if there is less, if the demand is as today, and there is less extraction, the price would go up, yes. This is true, which is good, isn't it? Because it will reinforce the profitability of solar energy and windmills and all things, in principle. But there is this problem of energy poverty, which I have not discussed very much, and that Henry Shue talks about it, yes. I think that nobody had said leave the oil in the soil until 1997. Except you could say that OPEC is doing this also, but not for environmental reasons. OPEC at the beginning couldn't care less about climate. In fact, they were against the idea of climate, not because they were American Republicans, but because they said the price of oil is going to go down. I remember talking, but anyway, there have been attempts to convince OPEC that they were wrong.
My question was exactly about this, that most of the oil comes from the Middle East and like Saudi Arabia and Iraq, and there doesn't seem to, on the map, I didn't see very many identified local conflicts in that area. So how do you deal with a situation where Latin American countries are stopping the extraction of fossil fuels, but the main producers are still not?
Now, one is that the map is being done now, and it depends a lot on the collaborators we have, and for this Northern Africa and so on, we are late in doing things. I'm sure there are conflicts, but it's true that when you have I don't know what will happen once we start trying to get more conflicts. The reason that China has little conflicts, for instance, or Indonesia, in which there are many conflicts, or Philippines, is that we don't still have our system going for collecting the conflicts. And we put this on the web, hoping that, and it has happened, that people would try to help. But obviously it must be true that in a desert is different from the rainforest, isn't it? So there are places which is more, yes. Also, we are not collecting, that would be interesting, this kind of geopolitical conflicts, because I suppose that one could have here in Iraq, one could have a rather big conflict, isn't it? Depending on how you interpret the history of Iraq since the beginning, or since 1991, or since 2003. Yeah. Conflicts mean, for these others, mean as social historians would do. Charles Tilly, if you are anybody here who knows, when you study peasant movements in history and you are trying to find in the archives whether people have mobilized in many different ways. Perhaps as peasants do, they do different things. They can do, they wouldn't do a strike, or they could in more recent times. Or the working class movement in Britain, for instance, in which words like pickets were invented, or boycott was invented, strikes were invented for this, which had become international. So you would look whether this kind of mobilizations occur. A strike of two people is not a strike, isn't it? So it's a bit like this. It's not a very rigorous kind of science in a way. But we see patterns and trends and so on.